Recently, I've been weighing up if I should just build a brand new PC or if I should upgrade my current one. Well, I could try to get a 5800 X3D, that's a bit over 550 New Zealand dollars. Okay, maybe I could get an AM5 chip like the 7500F or the 7600, but now I have to upgrade, and the motherboard and RAM as well. For that price, I might as well save up for something better like the 7800 X3D next year. I really want to get something right now to replace my 5600. I'm thinking I use AliExpress a decent amount, and everyone seems to like this 5700 X3D for around about 245 New Zealand dollars or 140 US dollars as of the 18th of December. Well, it's settled. I have it here, and did I get scammed? Let's find out. I bought it from the store on AliExpress, and there seems to be a few trusted stores, and on OzBargain there are a few posts that have links to trusted stores on AliExpress. The one I bought it from is currently out of stock, unfortunately. When mine arrived, the packaging looked decent and just comes in an OEM tray. The IHS is clean and the pins underneath seem to be straight, luckily. It looks brand new, but I'll go over that detail later on. Putting it in my PC was easy enough, and bam, we're good to go, and we booted up. If you're installing a new CPU, I'd personally reinstall the chipset drivers just in case I'm missing out on anything. That's just personal preference for me. Okay, so we know it's not a scam. We booted up, checked it's not a scam on CPU-Z, and the PC is running fine. So what in the world is the catch with the CPU? Let's check up on some benchmarks to see what's up. And let's get started with Assassin's Creed Valhalla at 1080p. The 5700 achieved 115.53 for average FPS and 68.60 for 1% lows. The average FPS on the 5600 was 114.83 and the 1% lows slightly more at 70.17. For 1440p, we pretty much get something similar again. For the 5700, it's 89.83 for average FPS and 1% lows is 56.57. Whereas the 5600 was 89.13 and 1% lows was 59.47. In both instances of 1080p and 1440p, we achieved pretty much the same result twice, so we could probably say for Assassin's Creed Valhalla, there isn't too much of a difference between these two CPUs. Counter-Strike 2 is up next, and we have the 5700 achieving 252.93 FPS on average at 1080p, and 1% lows was 87.03, whereas we found the 5600 was 198.20 and 1% lows at 66.90. Now at 1080p, we can clearly see that the 5700 X3D is a little bit faster, with a 27.6% percentage difference in average FPS and 30.1% higher in 1% lows. At 1440p, we have quite a different result. The 5700 achieved an average FPS of 195.43 and 1% lows at 65. The 5600 was at 194.90 and the 1% lows were at 63.70. As you can see, at 1440p, unfortunately, it didn't make too much of a difference, but at the 1080p result, we could see a significant difference in average FPS and 1% lows. Formula 1 2023 is up, and the 5700 X3D performed slightly better at 1080p, with an 11.7 percentage difference in average FPS and 15.9% higher in 1% lows. So this is a nice improvement that we see at 1080p here, and even at 1440p we see a similar result. The 5700 X3D achieved a 9.8% percentage difference to the 5600 on average FPS. Unfortunately, this wasn't true for the 1% lows at 1440p, with the 5600s being 102.43, whereas the 5700 X3Ds was 94.67. Little bit of an interesting result here, but overall not too bad, and we did have a decent performance uplift, especially at 1080p. Hitman 3 at 1080p was also about the same, the 5700X3D was 196.23 on average FPS, whereas the 5600 was 187.13 on average FPS. This was a 4.9% percentage difference, and the 1% lows were slightly better at 152.17 compared to 143.40 on the 5600. Let's check out the 1440p result. Unfortunately, it's pretty much the same result on the 5700X3D and the 5600. There was only a 0.5% percentage difference in average FPS, and only a 4.2% difference on the 1% lows. It's quite interesting how we're actually finding that at 1440p, a lot of these results are similar, whereas some of these titles, 1080p does have an advantage. Hogwarts Legacy is up next, and at 1080p, we got a 10.5% percentage difference on average FPS, and an okay difference in 1% lows, with the 5700s being 25.93, whereas the 5600s was 23.70. Kind of similar at that result. At 1440p, we finally have something a little bit different. So the 5700X3D achieved 73.93 FPS, whereas the 5600 achieved 66.07 on average FPS. The 1% lows were slightly worse for the 5700X3D at 20.23, and the 5600's 1% lows were 23.83, so a slight decrease, but the average FPS had a nice improvement. Lastly, we have Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. At 1080p, as you can see, the results were pretty much the same. The 5700X3D achieved 72.97 FPS on average, and 1% lows was 42.70, whereas the 5600s was 72.33, and the 1% lows was 43.03. Again, pretty much a negligible difference at all. They pretty much perform similarly, and the same thing goes for 1440p. I won't waste your time with this one. You can literally see they're pretty much the same result for 1080p and 1440p here. I have 3 synthetic CPU benchmarks here, and the first one is 7-zip with the decompression test on a 3-run average. For the average decompression on 7-zip, we got 104.2 for the score on the 5700X3D, and we got 84.63 on the 5600. That is a percentage difference of 20.72%. So not a bad improvement there at all. On Blender, on a 3-run average, we achieved 188.06 on the 5700X3D and 149.05 on the 5600. Now this was a performance gain of 26%, and I'm pretty happy with that, and it is to be expected. It is an 8-core CPU. Cinebench 2024 was an interesting result, and they were done on a 1-run average for both the multi and single core runs. The 5700X3D achieved 811 points for the multi-core and 85 points for the single core, whereas the 5600 achieved 654 for the multi-core and 89 for the single core. So we can clearly see that the multi-core was significantly better at a 21% performance difference. On the single core, we had a 4.49 percentage loss compared to the 5600. Pretty happy with these synthetic results, and we can clearly see that the 8-core CPU definitely helps in productivity tasks. We find that on the overall comparison, there was a 10.2% percentage improvement on the 5700X3D on average FPS for these 6 games. On the 1% lows, we found that this was a 10.94% improvement. So not a bad improvement over the 5600. For the overall comparison on 1440p, we don't have too much of a difference. We have a 3.15 percentage gain on the 5700X3D compared to the 5600 for average FPS, and we have a 5.66% improvement on 1% lows. Now overall, you can see that at 1440p, there wasn't too much of an improvement, and they were basically both under 6% each. So it's not too much of an improvement at 1440p, but when we were looking at 1080p, we're getting above 10%, which is not too bad. It'd be nicer if it was like 15% advantage towards the 5700X3D, considering it still costs 245 New Zealand dollars. But at the same time, I'm pretty happy with it at 1080p. From this small sample size of 6 games, we can draw upon a small conclusion here. The first is that at 1440p, the graphics card is pretty much rendering a higher resolution, so we get a similar result between the two CPUs, so it becomes more GPU dependent, especially at that higher resolution. And on 1080p, we see a larger difference in performance between the CPUs because the graphics card doesn't have to render out in such a high detail, so we become more CPU dependent. At least I'm pretty sure that's what's happening here, as that it would explain why the 1440p results are very similar and we see a slight improvement at 1080p. In any case, both of these CPUs perform relatively similar and depending on the title, so we can say in terms of performance on this small sample size on this particular system that at 1080p, there was an improvement with the 5700 X3D over the 5600, but at 1440p, they performed relatively similar. In comparison to my Ryzen 5 5600, it really isn't too much of an upgrade based on the games we saw from my RTX 3070 1440p. I will be doing a 20 game comparison video soon. It's just taking a while to process all the data, and it should be out shortly after this video releases. What we could tell from this small amount of data is that the 5700 X3D is a great value proposition if you plan to sell your Ryzen 5 5600, for example, for at least 100 New Zealand dollars, or the other AM4 CPU that you have. When you buy the 5700 X3D from AliExpress, you should be getting a decent amount off from the CPU you sold. Should you buy it in terms of performance? If you're already on something like the Ryzen 5 5600, you probably won't notice too much of a performance increase. If you're on something before the Ryzen 5000 series, so something like the Ryzen 5 3600, or from before this, you could see a nice jump in performance for any CPU reliant games or just in general. You are also getting 8 cores, even over the 5600's 6 cores, so in multitasking it did perform a little bit better, and we could even see this in the test. And through my own observation when I was editing on Premiere Pro, I could feel that it was a little bit better for editing. So we know this is a decent CPU in terms of performance, and especially if you're upgrading from before Ryzen 5000 series, but why in the world would you want to buy it from AliExpress? Well, in New Zealand, where I live, the 5700 X3D is over 400 New Zealand dollars. This one costs 245 New Zealand dollars. A similar price range would have only yielded something like the Ryzen 5 5600, which I already have. This is the end of life stage for AM4, and I might as well have the best that there is besides the 5800 X3D, which doesn't seem to be available anymore. See, I never pulled the trigger for the 5800 X3D as it just didn't make sense. The lowest I saw it go to was around about 450 New Zealand dollars from Amazon, and in New Zealand it never really came below 550. At that price level, the 7800 X3D was a much better buy and for the future as well. Also, AM5 is a bit out of reach because of the new motherboard and RAM I would have needed. On top of that, when I do actually decide to upgrade to something like the 7800 X3D in the future, I'll still be able to get a decent price for the 5700 X3D. Even if you wanted to build a decent budget PC for cheap, you probably could with a second-hand B350 board for under 100 New Zealand dollars, and with the 5700 X3D, I'd say you'd have an amazing PC on a pretty strict budget. Keep in mind, you will need to BIOS update for an older motherboard for it to be compatible. The 5700 X3D has 8 cores if you want to do multitasking, and it has the bonus V-Cache for gaming. Pretty much the best of both worlds on the CPU. As you can see, the 5700 X3D is a good compromise from AliExpress, as the price is low enough to upgrade while keeping its value if that matters to you. If you're spending more than 300 New Zealand dollars on the CPU, I'd say why not have a look at AM5. It should be better for future proofing, as well as the main point being the upgrade path. I'm pretty sure that the AM4 socket is done. I think this is it, and AMD probably won't put out any more CPUs as they have been in the last year or two. Now for the catch. Well, there's two that I can think of. First off is that maybe the CPU isn't brand new. Fine, maybe it's brand new and maybe it's not. I hope for integrity's sake, it is, but at this price, it could have already been used in some sort of rig, and I'd personally be okay with that. Keep in mind, mine did pretty much look brand new as far as I could tell, and even if it was secondhand, if I think about it, what AM4 CPU can I even get for 245 New Zealand dollars that is as good in performance? That's right, there's nothing. Even secondhand, I can't even get a 5800X3D for a similar price point. So if I want a Vcache CPU on the cheap, this is my only option. But what if it breaks? Because it's been used previously. That brings me to the warranty. Once the AliExpress buyer protection timer runs out, you're basically out of luck. There will be no recourse if the CPU breaks on you, and you're pretty much on your own. Unfortunately as well, you probably can't beg AMD for a repair or another CPU, as these are OEM, meaning they are meant for suppliers to use when building PCs to sell, so not for the consumer. As a result, they don't carry a warranty from AMD. Okay, you might be like, since when has a CPU ever broke on its own? Well, I had a 3700X and its memory controller stopped working, and I had to return it for a new one. It seldom happens, but the possibility is there. For me, the price was so low that foregoing the warranty and it maybe being secondhand didn't really affect my purchasing decision. But you have to weigh it up for yourself. I hope you get the reasoning on why it's actually a pretty decent buy if you're already on AM4, or if you can get a cheap AM4 motherboard such as a B350 secondhand. So there really isn't much of a catch besides the warranty, and it's been over a month and it's still running fine for me. It's really up to you if you want to take the risk for the discount, and I did, and I really couldn't be happier. That about sums it up. Check out wisetech.org for some more awesome content. But other than that, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!